So much more. I'm hesitant what to show, but we'll keep on going. For example, transitional justice in the immediate aftermath of 1798. There was transitional justice in the immediate aftermath of 1798. Lord Cornwallis brought in a policy of amnesty. Rebels who turned in their arms were supposed to get a pardon. If they get a pardon, everything is forgiven. And if it's forgiven, then it's forgotten. That was the policy that was brought in immediately after the rebellion, supposedly. It was undermined. It was undermined by loyalists who constantly wanted revenge, who demanded executions. And these executions undermined this policy of trying to actually bring forgetting. So social forgetting remembers cases of the execution of Henry Joy McCracken. Of course, that's a famous case. Maybe the most lenient of cases because they didn't degrade his body. He was buried without being decapitated. Others didn't. Others were decapitated and their head was left on a spike for months afterwards, and this was remembered. And all these stories of the violence of suppressing the rebellion, it was a terrible violence. For years, historians thought the rebellion in Ulster was a small rebellion and no violence was applied to putting it down. In fact, number-wise, it got the lion's share of violence was actually in the north. There are more court-martials that end with corporal punishment in the north and with death sentences and very violent deaths and lashes of hundreds of lashes. It's unbelievable the cruelty in which it was put down. So stories like this, sites like this, Watty Graham's Beach in Mahira. This tree doesn't exist anymore. I think in the 1940s it was struck by thunder, by lightning, and it no longer exists. It still exists in stories, of course, people can point it out. But in a place where you couldn't put monuments to the dead, you'd have stories about how Walter Grimes, the United Irishman, was executed on this tree, lynched more or less. The soldiers decapitated him, played football with his head, and so the wall, afterwards for years, people said they could point to where the bloodstains were. His servant, a Catholic servant, had to walk the streets and say, carry the head and say, here is the head of a traitor. But the inside joke in folklore was, and this is how you undermine it, he said, here is the head, poor crater. So the poor creature. So human euphemism works in different ways. These kind of sites stayed in memory under the surface. It's a form of dealing with something and not dealing with something. And they undermine the whole notion of amnesia from the very beginning. If we want to move on, actually I'll leave these captions, I'll go quickly, but the notion of, I have these kind of summaries, but you can see that on the poster afterwards more or less. The notion that we think that policies of amnesty initiate forgetting. In many ways they're undermined by the brutality of putting down a rebellion, and therefore they actually initiate hidden forms of remembrance which persevere afterwards. Another example, and again there's hundreds of examples as we move with time, but if we look at the generation, this I have to deal with if we're in this room, the generation of Mary Ann McCracken. What about the people who survived the rebellion? How did they preserve the memory of the rebels when they couldn't set up monuments, when they couldn't have gatherings to remember the people? Here we have to use sources in a sophisticated way. And people who have done tours here would be familiar with it. People like Philip would know it very, very well. But the notion about how a grave can be misleading. There are very few graves, but there are graves. You can follow each one of them of identified United Irishmen. The reason that there are few graves is most of them are buried in pits, collectively, which is what you did to rebels and to soldiers at the time. But this is an interesting one. If you go to Saintfield First Presbyterian Church, you'll find the grave of John Lowry. And on the grave you'll find that he died on the 19th of June 1798, which is a problem, because it's a week after the rebellion. But we know that he died on the 9th of June 1798. Why do we know that? From a few sources. But most importantly, Thomas Ledley Birch, another kind of vernacular historiography source. The Presbyterian radical minister who preached to the troops at Saintfield, who barely escaped the battle afterwards, who was caught by troops and was supposed to be hanged, but his own brother, again a case of a brother in the government forces, who's a captain in the yeomanry, testifies on his behalf, and therefore he's sent into exile. He barely makes it to the boat because Orangemen catch him and want to lynch him. Makes it to America, and when he's in America he writes anonymously his emigrant's letter home, which is actually his narrative of 1798. And in it we know that John Lowry died commanding a party of people. Now did his family forget the date? They didn't forget the date. You had to code it in a different way. So outside he didn't die in the rebellion. The community and those people who knew how he died. And these stories were kept by different people. You can't not mention this room, of course, Mary Ann McCracken and Jemmy Hope and James Hope, the generation that lived through these stories and kept them the whole time. And the closer they came to their death, and these people lived long lives, these two individuals, they became more and more anxious about who will take it to the next generation. They were afraid of people like Samuel McSkimmon, who tried to collect their papers, and they knew that he would put a loyalist slant on it. They didn't know what to do. But then they found a historian they could trust in the form of Richard Robert Madden. So Richard Robert Madden, a Catholic from the South, but they could identify exactly around the issues that we heard that happened in this room of emancipating slavery. He was a radical colonial administrator who was in charge of emancipation of slaves in various colonies. And they found a common language. And they saw his respect for the United Irishmen. So they could share with him his notes and their stories. So that's how some of these stories come out. And we could go through this again. This notion about how people learned coded forms to keep their stories quiet for generations. At the end of their life, often this dynamic recurs. They try to bring it out into the open. But even when they bring it out into the open, when you examine it carefully, you see that it's always kept in muted form. Something is told and something is masked at the same time. And that's a process which to see, you'll have to read the relevant bits in the book to see, because it's a complicated process. More than that, and I'll skip this bit, but social forgetting is not just generated. Generation of forgetting works on two levels. It's the generation that lived through the events, that had to deal with its legacy, but it's also generating this language of forgetting and social forgetting. But it's also regenerated. It's passed on to other generations. And you can follow the story through the 19th century, how time after time, traditions of keeping quiet about it, but still keeping the stories are passed on. And at different moments this can come out into the open, and at other moments it goes behind the scenes. Just to run through this quickly, I'll just skip this here. What happens when it does come into the open? I've gone beyond my limits by far here, but just well-known examples. When a monument is made around the time towards the centenary, for example, the monument of Betsy Gray. There's very few public memorials. If you look around Northern Ireland, you won't find public memorials to 1798, unlike other parts of Ireland, where the centenary monuments were put everywhere. When the monument to Betsy Gray was set up in 1896 in anticipation, and this all relates to the novel by Little, and there's a whole story behind it, and the success of this novel, which relies a lot on folklore, is what launches this initiative to set up a monument. What's interesting is, very shortly, even before the centenary, the monument is smashed. This is a nationalist depiction of how it was smashed. It was smashed in a very different way. It wasn't quite like that, but not all that far from it either. And it's interesting. When social forgetting is dragged into the open, when these traditions are not supposed to be shared into the open, often there's a backlash. In this case, a local community, heavily Presbyterian, observing the Sabbath on a Sunday, Unionist, didn't have a problem celebrating their heroine from 1798, but they had a problem with Catholics from Belfast travelling on a Sunday, and Peter's written about this quite clearly, travelling on a Sunday, often women, there's also a gender issue here, publicly laying wreaths on this grave. It's about whose memory does it belong to. And that's why decommemorating, it's the opposite of commemorating, smashing a monument, is supposed to put the memory away. But it doesn't put the memory away. It instigates forms of social forgetting. Because then time and time again you can go to the site and people will point to you where the stones are. And the stones will become smaller and smaller because people will chip away souvenirs to keep them. And they'll give it to immigrants going abroad to keep as souvenirs. And the immigrants will come and look for the monument. And this is a game that you can play there time and time again of people coming there. I experienced it myself as a student. The first time I went there, I was walking around with an ordnance survey map trying to figure out where the monument used to be. And somebody walks up to me and says, "Can I help you?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for an older monument." And he pushes the grass and says, "You're looking for this, aren't you?" And he'll show me the place. And then he'll tell me the stories. And from him I can get a poem which hadn't been recited in the area since the 1960s. Because since the Troubles broke out, you couldn't recite the poem anymore. So it's still happening around. I'm going to skip some things here because I've got a lot to kind of say. So give me a second here and we'll kind of bring it to an ending here because there's too much to be said. But I want to actually end with the contemporary. Actually, I was going to say something about Northern Ireland in the years of Stormont, but I won't say too much about that. But I will say that there was an opening up of memory around the time of the centenary and the fin de siècle, the beginning of the 20th century. The key figure here is, of course, Francis Joseph Biggar, who is dedicated to the memory of the United Irishmen and was respected by all sides. But when Northern Ireland was set up, this became a taboo, prescribed in many ways. You couldn't talk about the United Irish. It was too subversive. And I have a lot to say about that, but the key line to say about here is that there were always people who broke the silence. There were always people throughout the years who talked about the legacy of the United Irishmen. Some lesser known, some very well known. The book is full of the lesser known, but the well known, I'm sure you know, names like Hewitt, of course, John Hewitt. John Hewitt, his poetry referred to him. He wrote about the weavers. And yet even when he wrote about the weavers, he always stopped, didn't engage too quickly. His own thesis ends just before 1798, or starts just after 1798 to be more precise. He was careful how he dealt with these issues. He wrote a play about the United Irishmen, which he called The Parting of Friends, based on a song, but never published it. It was only published, it was never really properly presented. It's only been read at the John Hewitt Summer School, and was renamed The McCrackens. Sam Hannah Bell, of course, the famous novel, A Man Flourishing. No publisher wanted to publish it at first. It had to be cut down. A lot was taken out of that book, which is interesting. Seamus Heaney, well known for poems like Requiem for a Croppies. But Requiem for the Croppies is about Wexford, it's not about Ulster. Heaney grew up about traditions of Ulster. He slips them in quietly into some of his poems, but then he wrote a whole radio play about Henry Munro, the leader of the rebels at Ballynahinch, but never made anything out of it. So it's always about publishing, not publishing, saying, not saying. It's remarkable, this dynamic, as it returns again and again. So if there's something I'd like to end with, kind of in the context of Reclaim the Enlightenment, is about this unsettling, radical legacy of the United Irishmen, which is here to be uncovered and unpacked with a lot of care. During the years of the Stormont regime, it was forbidden. And at times when it wasn't forbidden, it was always problematic. It was always seen as being co-opted by militant Republicans, which was seen as dangerous. So there's always a dangerous issue. The Good Friday Agreement was supposed to put an end to that. It was supposed to celebrate traditions. But notice one thing, which should be clear in this room now, but maybe 20 years ago if I would have said it, and I was thinking about it as a student 20 years ago when I came to Ireland, but you couldn't say it because it was politically incorrect. It would have been disrespectful. There was something wrong with the Good Friday Agreement, which maybe was right in the Good Friday Agreement, but it was also part of its problems. The notion, which is so ingenious in the Good Friday Agreement, of parity of esteem, which appears again and again in the agreement, and it's so important that each community respects the other community. But what's the problem there? What's wrong about respecting other traditions? That's good. What's the problem?
Because there's a shared tradition in action.
That's very good there. And it's not only that. The idea is that there's only two traditions, even before that. That you have to choose your path, don't you? I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this one. You're either Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, or you're Catholic, Nationalist, Republican. That's how the parties have to swing. And if not, it's very hard to be the middle ground. We see time and time again what happens with those who try to take the middle ground. You have to choose which path you're taking and be very clear. And that's why the United Irish Heritage has always been a problem. Because it defies this kind of dichotomy. You have to find your place within it. So it always unsettles in different ways. I've got much more to say beyond that, but I think we can end with that there's a radical legacy there. And it's a legacy which has always been dealt with. There's always been dealing with the past here. But to look at it, we have to train ourselves to listen to a history of whispers, a history of euphemism, a history of coded messages, a history that sometimes emerges into the open and meets strong reactions and is suppressed and put away. A history which is often unpopular, but popular with some people who take it in different directions, and people trying to own it and take it to their own direction in different ways. If you want the last images, which I'll quickly run through, we would have thought, run through this as well, I'll skip it, that all of this ended in the bicentenary. Since the bicentenary, now it's open, we can set up monuments to the United Irishmen. It's not always clear. There aren't big monuments to the United Irishmen. The monument to William Orr, whose grave for years was unmarked as a family grave, is just a small plaque. There's no monument to William Orr, the Republican proto-martyr. Jeremy Hope, when the blue plaque was put up there, very shortly afterwards it was smashed. Commemorating and decommemorating go hand in hand. And it's these notions which we're still working through, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So I've spoken more than enough. Thank you very much.